let's begin with the three terms, that is the P generation, F1 generation and F2 generation. P generation, as the name suggests, is the parent generation. F1 generation is a cross-pollination or a cross of the parent generation. So you would have, let's say, a pea plant here, okay, and another pea plant here. What we are trying to do is trying to study the cross-pollination. So for this cross-pollination, what Mendel took was a pea plant with TT. So that's the tall trait, okay, and a small TT denotes the short trait. Now, while he was giving his study, what he did was he crossed these two. So when you cross these two, what would happen? You would have T, T, T and T. So all the generations would be what? All the generations, if I visualize, would be T and T. That would be the mix of these two generations, the parent generation. These are the P generations that are there. And this generation is the F1 generation. So all the four plants that we got, or all the four traits that we got here, have T and T trait. What does that mean? This means that all the plants by nature are tall, because the capital T is a dominant trait. So what he tried to explain was, every time you have a dominant trait and a recessive trait. Dominant trait is a trait which behaves or which dominates the scene, and as you can see, since you have even a single capital T here, this would be the dominant trait, and with one small t you would have a tall trait that would be present. So the new flowers that you would be seeing would be all tall in nature. Now this was the F1 generation. From P to F1 generation we come through cross-pollination. From F1 to F2 we come through self-pollination. Now how does it occur? Now I already have my F1 generation, which is TT. I self-pollinate means I cross it with another TT. Now let's work on this. So this is the cross-tabulation that we have. How does it work? You have capital T, capital T, capital T, small t, capital T, small t, and small t, small t. That means this is completely tall. These two are the mixed variants, but since T is tall, you have the tall species that is there, and this is the shortest species. Now how do you understand this? The very simple way is, we talk about two terms, phenotype and genotype. Phenotype means what is the physical appearance. So what is the physical appearance? I can say 1, 2 and 3 are tall, 1 is short. So phenotype ratio would be 3:1 for these four plants. However, the genotype ratio would be 1 tall, 1 short and 2 hybrid. So 1:2:1 would be your genotype ratio. This cross that we did leads to an F2 generation. So the resultants that we see here are of F2 generation. But what we considered here was just one trait, and that was tall versus short. And since we are considering only one trait, we call it as a monohybrid cross. Okay. Now, what Mendel did was, with this, he tried to explain a new concept where he used a dihybrid cross. So he believed that let me take two characters instead of one, and let's see how it proceeds. So in the parent generation, he took two characters, that was RR, YY and small r, small y. Now the capital R denotes round, small r denotes what? Wrinkled. So one characteristic was round and wrinkled. The other characteristic was capital Y denotes yellow, small y denotes green. Okay. Now what he did was he crossed these. When he crossed this, so this was the parent generation. The first cross would result into capital R, small r, capital Y, small y. And this was the F1 generation. This F1 generation was self-pollinated. So when I pollinate this with the same, what I would get? I would have R, R, Y, Y, capital R, small r, capital Y, Y. Okay, so that's how you have the 4 elements, but I would combine these elements. So let's say RY, capital RY, and small r, small y. So I would have capital R, small y, and small r, capital Y. Okay, and here what would be the traits would be again capital R, capital Y, capital R, small r is capital Y, and small r, small y. Okay, this is capital. Now when you cross this, how many conditions you would get? You would get 16 different conditions. Of this, only one condition that would be here, which would be small r, small y, small y. And this is the wrinkled and the green condition. There would be 3 conditions where you would have small r, capital Y, small y. Again you would have small r, capital Y. You would have small r, capital Y, small y. And these 3 would be the condition where it would be wrinkled, because small r stands for wrinkled. Okay, so these would be wrinkled and green. So small r, small y would be wrinkled and green. So only one case for that. Then you would have this as wrinkled and yellow. So wrinkled and yellow, I have 3 cases. Now the next case would be, I would have capital R, small y, capital R, small y, and then I have capital R, small y. So these are the 3 cases where I would have R and small y. So that means it would be round but green, and all other cases would be the remaining cases where it would be round and yellow. So 3 cases, 1, 2 and 3, which are round and green. 3 cases which I mark as cross as wrinkled and yellow, and 1 case which is wrinkled and green. The rest all are yellow and round. So what is my phenotypic ratio? Phenotypic is that what I can see, it is 9:3:3:1, and that's how we understand a dihybrid cross. But if we complete this and you see the genotypic ratio, that genotypic ratio would be very different. As in the case it was 1:2:1. So here again it would be 1:2:1, then again 1:2:1. But in the between you had these 2:4:2. And that's the complete sequence of the genotype that you would study further in the higher classes. If you want to solve this Punnett square, so this square that we draw is what is known as Punnett square. And when you solve this Punnett square, you would be able to have this genotypic ratio. So we talked about the F1 generation, which is also known as the first phylalial generation or the cross-pollination of the parent generation. F2 generation is the second phylalial generation or the self-pollination of the F1 generation.